I sat alone in the kitchen at 2 in the morning, the yellow light casting down on the wooden table that had been scratched by years of use. In front of me, the laptop screen was still open, displaying the invoice for the trip I had personally booked for my wife. 1 week in Maui, Hawaii, an ocean view resort, a good flight class, spa, yoga, meditation, everything Emily said she needed to find herself again. I stared at the total amount, then at the empty space in the house, and wondered why my chest felt so heavy, even though, in theory, I had just done the most reasonable thing a husband could do. Emily and I lived in San Diego, California, in a quiet suburban neighborhood where evenings were filled only with the hum of air conditioners and the distant barking of dogs. Our life had once been perfectly ordinary by American standards. I had a stable job in logistics, and she worked in marketing for a mid-sized tech company. We weren't flashy rich, but we were comfortable. We owned a house, 2 cars, and followed a routine so predictable it was almost boring. I used to think that was a good thing. It turned out that, to Emily, stability felt more like a cage. About 6 months earlier, Emily began to change. She complained of constant exhaustion, became easily irritated, and often sat in silence, staring out the window for long stretches of time. Evening conversations slowly turned into short, mechanical replies. When I asked if something was wrong, she said she felt empty, as if she were living someone else's life. I wasn't the kind of man who knew how to speak in poetic reassurances. I was used to solving problems with plans and actions. So when Emily said she needed time for herself, needed to step away from everything to recover mentally, I listened seriously. The idea for the trip was mine. I suggested that Emily travel alone, free from work and family obligations. I believed that if she could rest, if she could be somewhere unfamiliar, things might improve. I spent an entire evening choosing the resort, reading every review, comparing every amenity. I didn't hesitate over the cost, because at that moment, I had only one thought. If this marriage needed saving, this was a reasonable price to pay. Emily looked at me when I made the offer, her eyes carrying something that felt both relieved and distant. She nodded quickly. On the day Emily left, I drove her to San Diego International Airport. She wore a light jacket and pulled a small suitcase, looking more like someone heading on a retreat than a wife leaving her husband behind. At the security gate, she hugged me. The embrace was brief and loose, nothing like it used to be. "I just need time to breathe," she said. I nodded and forced a smile, even as a chill ran down my spine. When she turned and walked away, I stood there watching until she disappeared from sight. On Emily's first night in Hawaii, I stayed alone in a house that suddenly felt much larger than before. I cleaned the kitchen, turned on the television without watching it, and went to bed early. My phone buzzed. A message from Emily, accompanied by a photo of the beach at sunset. The sky was orange and red, the waves calm. "It's beautiful here," she wrote. I replied that I was glad she arrived safely and hoped she would feel better. I put the phone down and told myself everything would be fine. But lying in the dark, I couldn't sleep. In my mind, small details from the past months surfaced one by one. The nights Emily came home late without a clear explanation. The calls she ended abruptly. The evenings she said she needed to be alone. I pushed those thoughts aside and scolded myself for being overly suspicious. I wanted to believe that this trip was a necessary step back before we could move forward. I didn't know that in the moment I put Emily on that flight, I had given her more than a vacation. I had given her the opportunity to step away from our marriage without facing it immediately. And I, a husband who believed in reason and good faith, was standing at the starting line of a story I was completely unprepared to enter. 3 days after Emily arrived in Hawaii, I began to notice things that didn't line up. At first, it was just a vague feeling, like hearing a strange noise in your house without being able to tell where it came from. I still went to work as usual, attended meetings, answered emails, but every time my phone buzzed, I found myself waiting for more than an ordinary message. Emily texted less and less. Not in a way that suggested she was busy, but in a way that felt deliberate, as if she were slowly stepping out of our shared life. That evening, sitting alone on the sofa, I opened the location app on my phone almost unconsciously. Emily and I had shared the same iCloud account for years. We never thought it was an issue because there had never been anything to hide. A blue dot appeared on the map, but it wasn't at the resort I had booked. I zoomed in. The location shown was in a residential area, far from the beach and the resort zone. I told myself she might be out for dinner or attending some kind of therapy session. I closed the app, unwilling to turn myself into a suspicious husband. The next day, Emily replied to my messages very late. I asked how she was feeling, and she answered with a short sentence saying she was tired and needed rest. When I suggested a FaceTime call, she said the signal wasn't good. I accepted that explanation, but part of me began to register everything as disconnected data points. I didn't confront her. I didn't argue. I just observed. By the fifth day, the irregularities became harder to ignore. I opened the location app again, this time with the focus of someone accustomed to working with data. The blue dot appeared in the same place as the previous nights. The movement pattern repeated itself. Evenings, after 9 o'clock. Not once, not twice. I noted the address displayed on the map, an area called Kihei. A quick online search showed me it was full of short-term rental apartments, not luxury resorts. That night I checked the transaction history of our shared credit card. I didn't do it with the mindset of hunting for evidence of an affair. I simply wanted to know how our money was being used. Charges appeared. Local restaurants, small bars, late-night ride services. Things that weren't included in the resort package I had already paid for. I sat in front of the screen for a long time, not feeling angry, only a cold clarity settling in. The pieces were beginning to fall into place. A name surfaced in my mind unexpectedly. Ryan Cole. I remembered him as a former colleague of Emily's, someone I had seen at a few company gatherings years ago. Back then, I hadn't paid much attention. Ryan was talkative, always seemed to understand Emily. I had never imagined that name would resurface in this context. I had no direct evidence linking him to anything, but my intuition, something I rarely trusted more than logic, began to speak up. I didn't call Emily to ask where she was. I didn't send long messages demanding explanations. Instead, I started saving everything. I took screenshots of the GPS location day by day. I noted the movement times. I exported transaction statements. I wasn't doing this with the emotions of a betrayed man, but with the caution of someone who understood that if the worst truth turned out to be real, impulsiveness would only cost me the one advantage I still had: my composure. That night, when Emily texted to say she needed a few more days in Hawaii to truly recover, I replied that I understood and hoped she would take care of herself. I put my phone down and opened my browser. For the first time in my life, I typed a phrase I never thought I would need: California divorce attorney adultery evidence. When the list of results appeared, I didn't panic. I simply felt that I was stepping into a different phase of this story. I sat there, in the quiet house, and realized that there are moments in life when you can no longer pretend not to see what's happening. I still didn't know exactly what Emily was doing, but I knew one thing. If this was the truth, I wouldn't face it with shouting or tears. I would face it with data, with the law, and with silence. From that moment on, I stopped waiting for Emily to come back as she once had. I began preparing for what came next, even though I couldn't yet name it. I didn't tell Emily that I was coming to Hawaii. In fact, I didn't tell her anything new during those days. I continued replying to her messages with short, polite sentences, revealing no suspicion at all. I booked my flight early one morning, departing San Diego while the city was still asleep. On the way to the airport, I felt a strange stillness. It wasn't peace, but the feeling you get when you've accepted that something important is about to end, even though you haven't yet seen its final shape. Maui greeted me with harsh sunlight and the salty smell of the ocean. I didn't go to the resort where Emily had sent me photos from. I rented a small car and drove straight toward Kihei, the name that had appeared too many times on my phone's map over the past week. The coastal road was almost absurdly beautiful, but I had no mental space to enjoy it. In my head, everything was organized like a checklist: where, when, and what I needed to do to avoid making mistakes. I checked into a modest hotel, Nothing luxurious, just enough to give me a place to sleep without drawing attention. I called the attorney I had contacted back in California, Linda Parker. Her voice was calm and professional, not at all surprised when I told her I suspected my wife was having an affair. Linda didn't ask how I felt. She asked what I had. GPS logs, transaction history, time, location. She reminded me very clearly, no contact, no confrontation, no letting emotions lead the way. Everything I did from this point on had to be able to stand in court. On my first evening in Kihei, I parked far from the apartment complex the GPS had pointed to. I sat in the car, watching lights turn on and off on balconies above. I didn't know exactly which unit Emily was staying in, but I knew I didn't need to. I only needed to observe. Around 10 o'clock, I saw Emily step out of one of the buildings, wearing the dress I distinctly remembered buying for her last year. Walking beside her was a man, Ryan Cole. I recognized him immediately, even though it had been years since I last saw him. He placed his hand on Emily's back naturally, as if it were a gesture repeated many times before. My heart didn't race. I didn't feel anger. I only felt a wide, quiet emptiness open up in my chest. I took out my phone and photographed them from a distance, making sure the frame was clear, the streetlights visible, both of them captured together. I double-checked my settings to ensure the time and location were automatically recorded. I didn't move closer. I didn't call Emily's name. I watched them walk into the apartment together, the door closing like a final period. In the days that followed, I repeated the same process. I didn't stalk relentlessly or follow them recklessly. I recorded only what was necessary. The times Emily arrived and left, the occasions Ryan appeared, the moments clear enough that they couldn't be explained away. Each photo, each note, I organized carefully, like a case file. I slept very little, but my mind was terrifyingly clear. I understood that if I let myself fall apart now, everything I was doing would become meaningless. There was a moment, on the third afternoon, when I saw Emily sitting at a cafe with Ryan, laughing easily. A part of me wanted to walk in, sit across from her, and ask why. Why it had to be like this. Why everything had to end in such a quiet and cruel way. But I didn't. I turned away. I remembered what Linda had said. The truth doesn't need drama. It only needs to be documented correctly. That night, I sent all the data I had collected to my attorney. When I pressed the send button, I felt a strange sense of relief, as if I had set down a burden I'd been carrying for far too long. I no longer had to wonder whether I was imagining things. Those images existed. Those numbers existed. The truth had taken on a clear shape, no longer vague or deniable. On the flight back to California, I stared at the clouds through the small window. I thought about the house in San Diego, the quiet evenings, and the woman I had once trusted completely. I no longer thought about saving the marriage. I thought about the next steps, the decisions that needed to be made with a cold head. I knew that from this moment on, I was no longer a husband waiting for his wife to recover. I had become someone preparing to enter a legal battle where emotions had no place. And I was ready for that, even though I had never wanted to be. Emily texted me the next morning, saying she would stay in Hawaii a few more days because she wasn't ready to come back yet. I read the message in the familiar kitchen in San Diego, where everything was still in its old place, as if nothing had changed. I replied that I understood, and hoped she would do what was best for herself. I didn't ask anything else. I also didn't say that I had seen her holding another man's hand outside an apartment in Kihei. I put my phone down and opened my laptop. Some truths don't need to be spoken immediately, because when they are presented in the right place, they speak for themselves. I met my attorney in person for the first time that afternoon. Linda Parker's office was in a glass building downtown, cold and orderly. She reviewed every document I had sent, every photo, every GPS log, every line of financial transactions. Linda showed no shock or sympathy. She only asked questions, very specific, very precise ones. Those questions made me realize that no matter how strong my emotions were, they had no legal value unless they were transformed into evidence. Linda explained how divorce law in California worked. Infidelity alone didn't always determine everything, but the use of marital assets for an extramarital relationship carried significant weight. The Hawaii trip, the plane tickets, the accommodation, all of it had been paid for from our shared marital account. That turned this story from a personal tragedy into a clear legal issue. I listened, took notes, and for the first time in days, I felt that I was no longer drifting in uncertainty. We began preparing the case file. No rushing, no anger. Linda said that time was on my side, as long as I stayed silent and didn't alert Emily. I followed her advice. I continued replying to Emily's messages with neutral responses. I didn't act distant, nor did I express any desire for her to return sooner. I understood that while she believed she was controlling the situation, everything was actually being documented and organized systematically. A few days later, Emily told me she would return to California over the weekend. When I read that message, I didn't feel nervous or anxious the way I had imagined I might. I only felt that I was moving closer to a point of no return. Linda already had the divorce papers prepared. We waited for the right moment to file, ensuring that all evidence was complete and impossible to challenge. I signed my name on those documents with a calmness that surprised even me. On the day Emily returned, I didn't go to the airport to pick her up. I was at my attorney's office reviewing the documents one last time with Linda. When Emily entered the house and realized I wasn't there, she called me. I let the phone ring for a long time before answering. Her voice sounded tired, slightly confused. I told her I was busy handling some important matters. I wasn't lying. She just didn't know what those matters were. The divorce filing was submitted the next morning. Emily received the official notice while she was still unpacking her luggage. I didn't witness her reaction, but I could imagine it. The shock, the panic, and perhaps the anger when she realized that everything was no longer under her control. I sat in my car, parked by the side of the road, and felt a deep stillness settle over me. Not victory, not revenge, just clarity. That evening I returned to the house we shared. Emily was there. She looked at me as if I were a stranger. She started talking, fast, a lot, trying to explain, trying to reframe the story. I didn't interrupt. I let her finish. When she stopped, I simply said that everything would be handled through our attorneys. Not because I had nothing left to say, but because what remained should no longer be said between the two of us. That night I slept on the sofa. I stared at the ceiling for a long time and realized that this marriage had, in truth, ended before Emily ever boarded that flight to Hawaii. What I was doing now wasn't ending it. It was placing a legal period at the end of something that had been dead for a long time. And in that silence, I knew that the hardest part of the story was still ahead. The court date arrived faster than I had expected. I stood in front of the mirror early that morning, adjusting my tie and staring at my reflection for a long time. There was no anger and no sense of victory. Only a dry calmness, like before an important meeting whose outcome had already been calculated. I knew that no tears today would change anything. The family courtroom in California was nothing like what people see in movies. No drama, no noise. Just a room lit by fluorescent lights, wooden benches lined up neatly, and the tired faces of people ending a chapter of their lives. Emily entered with her attorney. She wore a simple outfit, her face pale, her eyes red and swollen. When our eyes met briefly, I felt no hatred. I only felt a great distance, as if we had belonged to two different worlds for a long time. The hearing began with familiar procedures. Emily's attorney spoke at length about her mental state, about emotional exhaustion, about the Hawaii trip being an attempt at recovery rather than betrayal. I sat still, hands resting on my thighs, listening to every word without reacting. I understood that, in this room, emotions were just noise. The only thing that carried weight was evidence. When it was my attorney's turn, Linda stood up and spoke calmly. She didn't attack Emily with words. She presented data. GPS records showed that Emily had not stayed at the resort as claimed. Credit card statements proved that money from our shared marital account had been used for personal expenses unrelated to the vacation. Photographs of Emily and Ryan appeared at the exact times and locations, clearly marked with timestamps and geotags. Each detail was placed on the table like a puzzle piece that could not be denied. I watched Emily as the evidence was displayed. She lowered her head, her shoulders trembling slightly. Her attorney tried to argue that no explicit, intimate acts were captured in the images. Linda simply responded that the issue was not whether the images were intimate enough, but that the use of marital assets for an extramarital relationship had been clearly established. The judge listened, took notes, and showed no emotion. As the room fell into a long silence, I realized that my marriage had finally been reduced to a file. All the memories, promises, and quiet evenings in San Diego had no place here. There were only numbers, timestamps, and decisions that had been made long before. I didn't feel loss. I only felt that I was witnessing a truth being placed exactly where it belonged. The judge announced a recess to review the materials. Everyone stood. Emily turned toward me, her eyes as if wanting to say something. I avoided her gaze, not out of fear, but because I knew that any words at this point would only be echoes of something already finished. I stepped into the hallway, leaned against the cold wall, and took a deep breath. I didn't pray. I didn't expect a miracle. I simply waited for a decision to be made based on what had been proven. When the hearing resumed, I returned to my seat. The judge began reading his preliminary findings. His voice was steady, impartial, unemotional. He mentioned the violation of marital duties, the misuse of shared assets, and the legal responsibility that followed. I listened to each sentence as if it were a final report. Nothing was surprising. There was only confirmation. The hearing ended in silence. Emily broke down in tears, but I didn't turn back to look. I stood up, adjusted my jacket, and walked out of the courtroom with my attorney. The sunlight outside was harsher than I expected. I paused for a few seconds on the steps, feeling the heat of the new day. The battle wasn't completely over, but from that moment on, I knew the balance had tilted in my favor. Not because I was smarter, but because I had chosen silence when it mattered, and allowed the truth to speak for itself. The ruling was read on a gloomy afternoon, when the light outside the courtroom windows had faded to match the faces inside. I sat upright, my hands clasped together, listening to every word with complete focus. I was no longer anxious. After everything that had been presented, the outcome felt like a formality. All I wanted was a clear ending. The judge spoke slowly, each sentence carefully weighed. He reiterated the key points. Emily's violation of marital obligations, the use of shared marital assets for an extramarital relationship, and the unavoidable legal consequences. I stared straight ahead, not turning toward Emily. I didn't need to look to know she was falling apart. I only needed to hear the confirmation that everything I had quietly prepared over the past weeks had finally been placed where it belonged. When the judge declared that the majority of the marital assets would be awarded to me, I didn't feel the relief I had imagined. I only felt a sense of order being restored. The house in San Diego, the savings, and the other assets were no longer symbols of a failed marriage, but the logical result of choices that had already been made. Emily lost the right to claim long-term spousal support. It wasn't punishment. It was consequence. I heard Emily break down in tears as the ruling concluded. The sound carried clearly through the silent room, but it didn't make me turn around. I had heard enough tears in other people's stories to know that, in this courtroom, tears didn't change anything. My attorney gave a slight nod, a signal that everything had gone exactly as expected. The hearing ended shortly afterward. I stood up, gathered my papers, and walked outside. No one was waiting for me in the hallway. No reporters, no questions. Only the cool afternoon air and the weight of exhaustion settling onto my shoulders. I sat down on the stone steps in front of the building and let out a long breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding the entire time. In the days following the ruling, I began dealing with practical matters, transferring accounts, closing shared credit cards, working with banks and relevant institutions. Everything was dry and mechanical. I handled one task at a time, like cleaning up backstage after a performance had ended. Emily and I barely spoke. All communication went through our attorneys. That made everything neat, leaving no space for emotions to intrude. One evening, I received an email from Ryan Cole. Just a few short lines saying he was sorry things had gone too far. I read the email twice, then deleted it without replying. I didn't feel the need to engage with someone who had exited my life that way. He was no longer my problem, and he never truly had been. Emily tried calling me once. I saw her name appear on the screen, and I let the phone ring until it went silent. I didn't hate her. I also didn't want to hear any more explanations. What needed to be said had been said in the courtroom. What needed to be decided had been decided by someone not bound by our memories or emotions. One morning, standing in the old house and looking at the walls where wedding photos once hung, I realized that the strongest feeling inside me wasn't victory. It was a deep exhaustion, paired with a slow, steady sense of relief. I no longer had to doubt, no longer had to monitor, no longer had to stay silent to protect myself. The battle was over. That night, I sat alone, opened a beer, and looked out at the backyard. I thought about the past months, about how everything had collapsed and then been rearranged into a different order. I didn't know what the future would look like, but I knew that from this moment on, my decisions would no longer be shaped by betrayal or fear of loss. The court's ruling didn't just end a marriage. It closed a chapter of my life that I had lived in silence for far too long. 3 months after the ruling, I moved out of the house in San Diego. There were no arguments, no witnesses, just me and neatly stacked cardboard boxes in the living room. I didn't take much with me. The things that truly mattered turned out to be very few. I left behind most of the furniture, the items Emily and I had once chosen together, as if I were closing a room full of memories with no intention of returning. My new apartment was in Northern California, much smaller, quiet, and unconnected to any shared memories. On the first morning waking up there, I realized I no longer startled at familiar sounds. There was no habit of turning to the other side of the bed to see whether Emily was awake. Everything felt empty, but not heavy. It was a clean emptiness, like a blank page that hadn't yet been written on. I returned to work slowly, not throwing myself into it as an escape and not neglecting myself either. I reorganized my schedule, focusing on projects I had always postponed because of family. My colleagues didn't ask many questions. In the US, people respect personal boundaries, especially after major life events. I knew a few people had heard the story, but no one tried to dig deeper. That made it easier to breathe. Emily texted me for the first time after the ruling on a rainy evening. She said she wanted to meet, just to talk, to close things properly. I read the message for a long time, not because I was undecided, but because I was listening to my own feelings. I realized I no longer needed to be understood or apologized to. I didn't reply. A few days later, Emily showed up outside my building. I saw her through the window, standing under the awning, soaked from the rain, thinner than before. A part of me recognized the image, like an old habit that hadn't fully disappeared. But I didn't open the door. I stood still inside the apartment, listening to the rain and to the sound of her footsteps eventually walking away. There was no climax, no dialogue, just a quiet ending, exactly the way everything had unfolded from the beginning. Later, I heard that Emily had lost her job. No one explained the details, but I understood that personal upheaval rarely coexists with professional stability. Ryan had already disappeared from her life earlier, when things stopped being easy and exciting. I didn't feel satisfaction. I didn't feel pity either. I simply noted the information the way one notes the weather. There is rain, there is sun, and everything continues. Some evenings I sat alone, looking back at everything that had happened over the past year. I no longer asked, what if? Those questions led nowhere. I only asked myself what I had learned. I learned that silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes, it's the only way to protect what remains of yourself. I learned that not every relationship deserves unconditional sacrifice. Once, while cleaning out an old mailbox, I found a wedding photo that had never been hung. I stared at it for a long time. The two people in the picture looked happy, trusting, completely unaware of what lay ahead. I didn't tear it up. I didn't keep it either. I placed it in an envelope, sealed it, and put it away. Some things don't need to be destroyed to prove that you've let go. My life gradually settled into a new rhythm. Not exciting, but steady. I started exercising more regularly, eating more simply, and giving time to things I had once considered secondary. I wasn't looking for a new relationship, not out of fear, but because I didn't want to fill the emptiness with haste. I let things move at their own pace. One evening, sitting on the small balcony of my apartment, I looked at the city lights in the distance and realized that I no longer felt pulled back into the past. What had happened didn't disappear, but it no longer defined me. I had passed through the darkest part of this story, not by defeating someone else, but by preserving my own integrity. And in that quiet realization, I knew I was ready to move forward, even though I didn't yet know exactly where the road ahead would lead. A year passed since the ruling was issued. I didn't mark the date on my calendar, nor did I do anything special to commemorate it. It was simply another point in time, quietly passing like any ordinary day. That morning, I woke up early, made coffee, and opened my laptop to check work. In my inbox, there was a bank notification reminding me of the final payment related to the asset division. I looked at the number, confirmed it, and closed the window. There was no strong emotion attached. It was just something that needed to be completed. My life was more orderly now. I worked steadily, kept relationships at a reasonable distance, and spent more time with myself than before. I didn't tell my story to many people, not out of shame, but because I didn't want it to become my identity. What had happened was a chapter of my life, not the entirety of who I was. I understood that more clearly than ever. From time to time, memories of Hawaii still returned, not as pain, but as a lesson that had been underlined. I remembered staring at the trip invoice, the heavy feeling in the kitchen at 2 a.m, and the long silences in the courtroom. Those memories no longer held me back. They simply reminded me that trust, when placed in the wrong hands, comes with a very specific cost. I ran into Linda Parker one afternoon by chance at a cafe near her old office. We exchanged brief, polite conversation. She asked how I was doing these days. I told her I was fine. It wasn't a courtesy, it was the truth. Before we parted, Linda said I had handled everything the right way. I nodded and thanked her, realizing that her validation no longer mattered to me. What mattered was that I hadn't betrayed myself. I didn't know how Emily was living now. I heard a few scattered updates through old acquaintances, but I didn't look further. Not because I feared the truth, but because it was no longer relevant to the life I was building. Some relationships, when ended properly, only slow your progress if you keep looking back. One late afternoon, I reopened an old folder on my computer and accidentally saw the files once used in the divorce case. GPS logs, statements, photographs. I stared at them for a long time, then deleted everything. Not because I wanted to deny what had happened, but because I no longer needed to carry them. They had served their purpose. The truth doesn't need to be stored forever to prove that it once existed. That night, I stood on the balcony, watching the city lights gradually come on below. I thought about the man I had been a year earlier, the man who believed that sacrifice and good faith could save anything. I didn't blame him. I understood why he had made those choices. But I also knew that without going through all of this, I would never have learned how to draw clear boundaries for myself. I don't consider myself the winner of this story. Winning implies a loser, and I don't want to define my life through that comparison. What I gained was clarity, self-respect, and a calmness I had never known before. In America, people believe the law exists to protect those who keep a clear head. I trusted that, and it did not betray me. When night fully settled, I went back inside, closed the balcony door, and turned off the lights. I didn't carry the old story with me to bed. I left it behind, exactly where it belonged. Tomorrow would begin like any other day, quiet, undramatic. But I knew that from this moment on, I walked forward on firmer ground. I knew who I was, what I accepted, and that I would never again trade my own calm for the sake of holding on to something that no longer belonged to me.